I'm David Bang, and from Impact Alpha, this is an Agents of Impact podcast.
Right, we understand at some level instinctively that in our era, company success becomes a liability because the more golden the goose, the more tempting it is to butcher it, the more valuable it becomes as a target. So I would like those of us who care about organizations, to stop being so naive about how to protect them.
That's Eric Ries, who inspired many a founder with his book, The Lean Startup, and then went on to found the Long-Term Stock Exchange. He's rounded up what he's learned in a new book, Incorruptible: Why Good Companies Go Bad and How Great Companies Stay Great. Many of the so-called best practices in corporate governance, he says, actually destroy value, and Silicon Valley founders ignore governance until it's too late. My colleague Amy Cortese spoke with Eric about spiritual holding companies, think perpetual purpose trusts, employee ownership trusts, and industrial foundations that put a check on for-profit boards. Human flourishing, he says, rather than profit maximization, should be the true purpose of companies, and he has some ideas of how to build organizations that can resist both inside temptations and outside pressure to betray their missions. I think you'll enjoy their conversation.
Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're thrilled to have you. I've been following your career. The Lean Startup, which I have on my bookshelf, came out in 2011. The next year, you launched the Long-Term Stock Exchange, kind of as an antidote to the short-term thinking and decision-making that dominates Wall Street. And now your new book, Incorruptible: Why Good Companies Go Bad and How Great Companies Stay Great, comes out later this month. So explain for us the evolution of your thinking that led to this book.
Sure, yeah, thanks very much for having me on. There's a through line through all of my work, which is really about how to build great organizations. Not just, okay, we made a little money, okay, we got lucky, but no, how do we create innovation that can really work in any kind of environment, no matter how much uncertainty, and one that really uses the scientific method, that has more humane values than others in business preach. And so I've had the privilege, over the past 15 years, to help a lot of people build a lot of companies. I'm really proud of that. A lot of those companies are incredible. People have made billions of dollars, had really positive impact. And yet a lot of those companies have ultimately been destroyed. And it's not so much that they failed in the marketplace. Of course, we got plenty of that. But then we have these companies that exhibit what I call unusual failures, where their very success becomes a liability. And they lose that special spark, the thing that made them worth creating in the first place. Maybe the founder got ousted. Maybe the founder lost control of it, like Frankenstein and his monster. Or in a lot of cases, there's just an outright betrayal by a board or private equity or some other actor. And I got really interested in this question because I was taught, like I think a lot of us were, that this is just inevitable. There's going to be a certain amount of that. There's going to be, that's what capitalism is all about. That's why we have shareholder primacy. It's just a necessary part of the system. But the more I have studied it, the more I have learned, the more I was building a company called Long-Term Stock Exchange, I learned a lot about corporate governance. And I found out that many of the so-called best practices that we're teaching people about how organizations need to be are actually value destroying. And so I started to get really interested in how could we build organizations that could resist this corruption. And I got a chance to put it into practice with a bunch of companies. And between that and the academic research, I started to feel like, wait, there's a thesis here. We could actually develop a new set of best practices that put human flourishing at the center of organization building instead of financial extraction.
In the book, you define profit as maximizing human flourishing, and you also introduce this concept of the spiritual holding company, which is meant to safeguard a company's mission. These are things that many of our readers, impact investors, already kind of internalize, although maybe not in that exact language. Can you elaborate on some of those concepts for us?
Yeah. I think your readers will find this very familiar, I hope anyway. But my experience has been a lot of us who believe these things intuitively, we don't always have the language and the concepts to defend it in the face of a very hostile financial system. So I really wanted to give language like that. Really, to me, like the success of Lean Startup really stems from its ability to put into words concepts that many of us had felt intuitively, but couldn't quite describe and therefore couldn't quite defend. So yeah, starting with the proper definition of profit, your audience will be very familiar with the problems with this mental definition of profit we all carry around, even if we intuitively understand that the best way to make money is to create more value than you capture. We often carry around a mental image of profit that's really just about profit and loss, revenue minus expenses. And that divergence between what we believe in intuitively and what we formally have been taught often reveals itself in strange ways. So just to give a couple of examples, the issues with profit in its conventional definition are obviously well known to your readers, so I won't belabor them, but just to say, if you take even an Econ 101 class, they will mention in passing that most definitions of profit do not properly account for deferred liabilities. They do not properly account for negative externalities, nor do they properly account for the full costs of the input factors of production, including if a human life is destroyed as a necessary part of the production process. We don't account for that as a dollar loss. So these kinds of problems, I think, are fatal to the definition of profit if we actually want to build lasting companies. Each of them, as I explain in the book, is a vector through which corruption can enter. Because as long as an organization can be tempted to make money while betraying its mission or purpose, then it will always be vulnerable to this kind of corrosion of the joints. That's kind of the image I have of what corruption is like. So and then, sorry, you asked me about the spiritual holding company. So that's on the problem side. Like, what is wrong with our current way of building companies? And I don't want to shy away from the darkness of this. Like, it's the way we're teaching people to build companies is very dark. Part one of the book is literally called "The Shape of the Abyss," so you can get a sense of where my head was at. Not going to pull any punches with this. I think there's something very dark in the system, but we don't need another manifesto, for God's sake. Like, I just felt like we have so many books that are about the problem and how bad it is. But I wanted to write a book that is about the solution. What is the blueprint that we as organization builders and those who care for organizations, investors, customers, employees, everybody who's in this economy together, what can we look for as the indicators that a company is in fact built to resist corruption? So it's a blueprint, and the culmination of that blueprint is to look at what today are considered to be kind of quirky alternative governance systems, which I think is really interesting. So, I work in Silicon Valley, so I work with a lot of founders, a lot of first-time founders, a lot of people who are steeped in company building. But then I also work with a lot of VCs and bankers and people who build their whole career here. For most of these people, the precedents for doing things differently are completely unknown. So when someone proposes building something with this two-entity structure where you have some kind of set of trustees who have the responsibility of overseeing or holding accountable the for-profit board of directors, that goes by a lot of different names in the academic literature. So I decided to give it a new name as the kind of omnibus term for all these different structures. I call it the spiritual holding company, the entity with the responsibility of holding the spirit or essence of the whole, rather than just like a traditional holding company like Berkshire Hathaway that is the financial owner of the subsidiary.
Sure. So would that be things like perpetual stewardship trusts, or I'm forgetting the names now, but there are a whole bunch of those things.
Yeah, so the most common structures that people will have encountered will be things like what's called the industrial foundation structure. That's like Novo Nordisk with a nonprofit foundation that oversees the for-profit subsidiary. The perpetual purpose trust, that's the structure that governs Patagonia. You might be familiar with an employee ownership trust. That's the structure that that oversees the John Lewis Partnership in the UK, or an ESOP, which controls my good friends at Taylor Guitars and make sure that the craftspeople always have the control over the quality of the guitars. And then of course you have cooperatives like Vanguard or REI or Mondragon in Europe. Those are three different kinds of cooperatives. So there's quite a lot of these different structures. What's wild to me is that I thought when I first encountered these structures, they were very niche and weird and uncommon. But that's not really true. Like, depending on how you count, like single digit percentages of the world GDP already flows through these structures. The German optics company Zeiss had the industrial foundation structure in like 1887. So it's not really new. And in fact, we have really good academic research on how it performs. And it turns out that this is a more stable structure. Companies that have this structure are much more likely to live to year 50 than companies with a conventional structure. So it's not just about ethics or impact or double bottom line or whatever, just measured on the basis of profitability and longevity. These structures already have a lot of evidence in their favor.
Well, again, we've written about many of those things. I wonder how this message is being received with, sort of Silicon Valley crowd and a broader audience.
Yeah, it's very different depending on how close people are to the heart of finance. And it's the kind of governance class of people that are really steeped in the shareholder primacy philosophy. Interestingly, Silicon Valley, today, Silicon Valley is seen as this big establishment place where people are making a lot of money, but it's still very far from that world. To its detriment, I think a lot of the naivete that comes out of Silicon Valley, a lot of the problems we get are because founders and investors here don't take governance issues seriously until it's too late. So the reception has been extremely warm. I've been really thrilled with the way that has been received here in Silicon Valley. But as you can imagine, among people for whom um, this is challenging in orthodoxy, it's been more challenging. And I'll you may find this funny. There's also a big generational divide in the response. So one of the early test readers was a very generous economics professor from the University of Chicago, and you can imagine he's steeped very much in a particular idea about capitalism. But he actually liked the book a lot and wrote to me about the things that he liked about it. But he also was like, you're being very harsh on capitalism here. I think you're being too critical. Capitalism is actually great. Hedge funds and private equity are great. You're not. And he was kind of going through all these different points. And what's really interesting to me is two things. One, I said, look, you may not realize this, but very many of the points that you're raising, I don't say anything about capitalism. I was just reporting the facts as established in the academic literature. If you find the fact that, for example, 5% of pharma acquisitions are so-called killer acquisitions that are demonstrated to destroy the R&D of the thing being acquired, if you feel that's a critique of capitalism, that's really interesting. I didn't say that. That's your interpretation. But more importantly, several Gen Z readers, you find the book too critical of capitalism, but I've had two different Gen Z readers told me this is the first book I've ever read that defends capitalism. So, which is it, right? Like, I think there's something really interesting about the way that we have this generational divide now, where people who have grown up in the shadow of the institutional collapse we see all around us, that's being driven by shareholder primacy, they have a very different view of what we want from our organization and institutions than older readers do. And they've been incredibly supportive of the book.
You do talk about shareholder primacy, and stakeholder primacy was sort of in vogue for a little bit. Remember when the Business Roundtable and BlackRock and everybody was talking that up? So that has kind of fallen by the wayside in the mainstream these days, but it's still, I'm just wondering what your view is on that, because that's taking into account a broader range of stakeholders, which I would think would play into your thesis here.
Yeah. So I tried to write the whole book without using trendy modern business language like stakeholder, which was very difficult given the topic. But I just felt like too many of the people talking about stakeholder capitalism, they're not being specific enough about what they mean. So when we say you need to consider all the stakeholders, most of the CEOs I know have no idea what that means. They're like, well, consider them in what way? The stakeholders all disagree with each other about what we should do. The investors want lower wages, but the employees want higher wages. So what am I supposed to do? Just compromise and have medium wages? Like doesn't really make sense. Plus, a lot of these statements, you know, in Silicon Valley anyway, we called them fakeholder commitments. They're not actually making a promise to do any specific thing. And in fact, the academic research has been very bad because it happens to be that right after the BRT letter was signed, we had the pandemic. So there was like an instant test of companies' commitment to these so-called stakeholders. And in fact, signatories of the BRT letter were more likely to do things that were cruel to their employees than non-signatories. So I think it was not really the right reform at the right time. And I think precisely because it was so vague, it was unclear if this is a sincere commitment to something or this is just a way to evade accountability from shareholders, which is, of course, how a lot of people on Wall Street saw it.
Yeah, like
So this
so.
book is not, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, like so many things.
Oh, like so many, exactly right. Like the hypocrisy here is ridiculous. And part of the reason we see so much hypocrisy is because of the way the ESG movement is conceived. In many cases, the governance best practices, so called, that are required to get a high G score are antithetical to what you would need to do to have a high E or S score. So I think by bundling this kind of very shareholder centric view of governance in with environmental and sustainability concerns, we've actually smuggled in the very problem that ESG investors should be trying to push back against. So yeah, I instead of talking about stakeholders, I want to know what a company's fiduciaries are. So I have this very old-fashioned view that companies should be willing to make fiduciary commitments to the people it would rather die than betray. That's what I want to know. And it's so interesting the way we see this as managers is so different than how we see it as consumers. So, for example, if you swallow a pill manufactured by a for profit company, or you eat food that you did not grow and make yourself, you are literally betting your life that the company who made that product has calculated that it's in its shareholders' best interest to keep you alive. Does that seem right to any normal person?
It's a
Like,
little
just like,
alarming.
it's alarming, right? And people say everyone's like, Eric, you are exaggerating. Nobody thinks like that. But read the governance literature. I have it in the book. I quote all these people. Like, I really wanted to make sure people understand what shareholder primacy means. They literally write things like, it is impermissible for a company to consider externalities, aka you and your life, except insofar as that benefits its shareholders. So that is considered a well-established and obvious point amongst the governance class, and yet normal people consider that to be downright sociopathic. So I don't think we should ever trust a company whose mission statement diverges from its legal purpose. And that's why I hate mission statements. I want to know what companies are actually genuinely structurally committed to the mission. Those are the companies I'm prepared to trust, and that's why a lot of the stakeholder discourse is kind of silly. So yeah, I tried to write about things that are just have much more specified meanings, and where the prescription to managers is more clear.
Okay, fair enough. I want to go back to the lean startup for a moment. The book celebrated minimum viable products, pivots, failing fast, all of which have become hallmarks of Silicon Valley today. Do those principles still hold up in the age of AI when there is so much at stake?
Oh yeah, even more so. The the general trend since I wrote the Lean Startup in 2011 has been an increase in the democratization of the tools of production. So what Karl Marx called the ownership of the means of production, we now entered an era of the rentership of the means of production. Like, you can literally be a first class competitor of a big established company with, a credit card and a couple $100. That's really remarkable. AI has intensified and amplified that trend, of course. But also, we see a massive increase in the amount of uncertainty, both uncertainty being driven by technological change and, of course, by the first trend, but also we are obviously entering a world of exogenous uncertainty driven by macro events also. So, in a period of high uncertainty, but the ability for rapid cycle time, that really is the sweet spot for lean startup, precisely because most business planning methods from the 20th century really rely on the ability to plan and forecast what is supposed to happen. And that's really difficult in our highly uncertain world. You think about these AI companies being asked to forecast their revenue for next year. And it's like they can't even forecast the revenue for next month because we don't know, there could be a deep seek moment any minute, any second it
Hmm.
could happen. So customers of those labs are under an even more intense level of uncertainty. And so agility really is the only rational response to that level of uncertainty. And I think that aspect of lean startup has held up very well.
Okay, great. And Eric, you've been in the thick of the tech scene for decades, I would say, right? So,
Mhm.
how do you explain the rightward lurch of Silicon Valley, including some of your long term stock exchange investors?
Yeah, yeah, that has been really interesting. First thing you have to understand is that the supposed lurch of Silicon Valley as a whole is much more of a mirage. Like, if you look at the polling, Silicon Valley has always had a relatively active minority of people who lean right instead of left. And although they were less vocal about it in the past, they got very activated with Trump. Trump brought something out in them that they were excited to really amplify that. And because, in particular, the dynamics of 2024, I was right in the middle of it. I know so many people on the left and in the center who were simply afraid to speak up. So you had this. muting of the typical voices who would be loud about political stuff and this amplification of voices on the right. It gave this perception. But if you look at the polling of tech people, of Silicon Valley, of tech workers, it's still a very, very lopsided population. That really hasn't changed. But I do think one thing that surprised me really, and I really took my breath away, was the number of people on the right in tech, including some who I thought were very reasonable and principle driven, who basically threw over their own principles because they saw a tremendous opportunity for material advantage, aligning themselves with the MAGA movement. And I would never, it just never struck me as the type. They're already so rich. They already have everything they want. Like, why would they do this? I could never have foreseen things like Doge or the kind of like gleeful attacks on science, but that redound to the benefit of certain specific companies or certain specific investors. That has been very surprising to me and very sad. And I think ultimately is self undermining. I mean, we just saw the president has announced that they're going to start vetting the release of AI models. And that was like the original sin, supposedly, of the Biden administration, was having any kind of light touch regulation of AI models. All of a sudden, we see the complete 180, reaping what they have sown. And yet crickets from those people who were so loud and angry about Biden doing it. It tells you all you need to.
Yeah, and on that note, any thoughts on Anthropic's governance model?
Well, they're in the book, so I tell the whole story because I played a bit part in it.
Oh,
And
nice.
I don't want to overclaim my role here. I really don't take any credit for their incredible success. But part of the reason I think that they are widely seen as of the most courageous of the AI labs, having been willing on multiple occasions now to stake their reputation and even to turn down significant amount of money in defense of their principles, has to do with their structure. And I think they're, we'll see what the future holds. They're under an unprecedented amount of pressure for a private company. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this before. So we'll see if the strength is truly there to resist. But so far, I think the early returns are pretty promising.
Yeah, it's a perfect case study of your themes here.
Oh yeah, no, very much so. And they really exhibit both of the elements, which is both they have the ethos, the strong internal alignment around a principle, that they really believe in AI safety and criticize them as you will. They believe it. They think this is a technology that should be used for the benefit of all humanity. And they have this structure. They call it the long-term benefit trust. We had to work on that. It took 2 years to get it implemented. It was not an easy lift. Because remember, when they started, they weren't the world beater trillion-dollar company they are today. They were like first-time technical founders. But they took the need to protect the mission really seriously. And they were willing to implement a structure in which they have that two-tiered thing we were talking about before. They have a perpetual purpose trust with trustees who have the ability to appoint directors to the for-profit board.
Your book also calls for new civic infrastructure for things like AI governance, climate, healthcare, gig worker protections. What does some of that look like in practice?
So, in the sociology and in the economics literature, we have these very similar ideas of the role that infrastructure plays in economic institutions and in kind of social regulation. Things like that are not quite strictly speaking entirely for profit, nonprofit. They're not exactly public sector, private sector, everything from stock exchanges to libraries. They play a role in not just serving customers, but in helping other organizations or institutions thrive. They provide so much of the hidden regulation that determines what are the options we see in our life. I give the example in the book that you walk into a convenience store, you use your credit card to buy a banana, and that took you 10 seconds. But like literally hundreds of organizations had to put their imprint on that transaction. Like incredible the phytosanitary standards, the banking standards, the anti-fraud standards, the UPC, all the work that was necessary to make this seamless for you. It shows the imprint, the fingerprint of these vast network of kind of hidden foundational infrastructure kind of organizations all up and down our organizations. Things like Underwriters Laboratory, the little UL circle. Most people have never even thought about what kind of a thing is UL. Why is it everywhere? But electronic devices that don't have that mark can't be sold because they're not safe. And I go into the history of how and why these organizations came to exist. but we kind of have lost the knack for building these things. If you look at the history, if you look at all the organizations that govern our modern life, many of them were developed by our grandparents in their generation. We kind of have inherited this rich tapestry of institutions, and we don't really know how to run and operate them anymore. And we certainly don't see ourselves as capable of building new ones. Like, I just ask people to imagine if there were no libraries in the world today and you had the idea for a library, would you be like, oh yeah, of course that's the kind of thing we could do? Like, no, you'd be like, no, come on. Like, all these things have been grandfathered into our economy. We don't really know how to make them anymore. So I tried to show the way with the long-term stock exchange. That was my attempt, not just to build a company, but to demonstrate that this kind of civic institution building is possible, even even in this age, and hopefully give people inspiration to look for opportunities like that all around them, which I think are many, because our institutions are failing. We are living in a time of collapse, not a time of institutional success. So there's going to be a need with this new technology, especially a need for new institutions. And if we don't intentionally design them with good civic values from the beginning, we kind of get the mess that we see in a bunch of areas. So I want entrepreneurs to take up this challenge.
Yeah. Do you have any proposals that flow out of that?
Well, the book is not really a policy book, so I tried to leave it up to the reader to imagine this. But for every major crisis, you can imagine the need for coordinating bodies that would tackle that crisis. But I'll give you one example that I think is really obvious and a no-brainer, that I've so far been able to interest exactly zero press outlets or in kind of people of influence to even think about or be interested in. So we have a double problem right now. We have every AI lab in the world is building a model that, in order to succeed, required the use of every single piece of creative output that humanity has ever generated. Every tweet, every random blog post, every Reddit post, every book, every magazine, every movie, everything. We needed all of that data to generate the models. So we have a copyright problem. Who who should be paid for the fact that we have created literally trillions of dollars of value on the backs of this creative output, and this is all being litigated in the courts in the most inefficient way possible. But and of course, the labs now are rich enough to be able to afford the many, many, many lawsuits. They're being sued left and right, and because they're being sued so much, they're trying to figure out exactly how to access all this data without triggering lawsuits. So the specific way that Anthropic happened to scan the books of all the authors of the world got them in trouble, and they're going to have to pay a big payout. Anyway, it's a big mess because no one has ever regulated this kind of work before. But intuitively, the narrow legal statute of copyright is just very obviously, to most normal people, this is inadequate for handling this situation. I always say to people, if you think having your work involuntarily added to these models without your consent is bad, try being excluded from the models without your consent. That's actually even worse. So we have a big copyright mess. On the flip side, we have all this possibility of job disruption and the possibility of the economic prosperity created by the whole world's creative output could flow only to a few people. That's intolerable. And then also you have the problem that there is no governance. There are no standards. We can't even say what is appropriate behavior for these companies. So to me, that suggests a very obvious civic infrastructure solution, which would be the equivalent of a sovereign wealth fund that would take positions, own some of the upside of all of these AI companies in exchange for having a regime of compulsory licensing of copyrighted work such that the holders of the copyright could be compensated out of the sovereign wealth fund. This is very similar to how the Alaska Permanent Fund works. It's how some of the very natural resource rich countries like Norway handled the what they call the resource curse. So artificial intelligence is like the ultimate of these resources. And if we don't want it to become a resource curse, we should be proactively trying to govern it and proactively trying to make sure that its benefits are broadly shared.
I don't know. I've actually seen a fair amount of traction for that idea of an AI sovereign wealth fund, funded from the massive profits of some of these big tech firms, but more applied to compensating the workers who helped produce the value and then watch their jobs eliminated as a result. But yeah, it's a
Yeah,
fascinating idea.
there's a lot there where you just clearly are going to have to match supply and demand here. Like, it's just not right for this technology to be to be owned and operated by such a small number of people, and it's just not right that the prosperity of it should be so narrowly held, given that it was a collective, like the birthing of it was a collective act.
Yes, and just on a side note, my book, which also came out in 2011, but was nowhere near as successful as yours, but is part of the Anthropic class action. So,
We all are, all of us. I mean,
yeah.
it's just it's an absurd situation. I am apparently simultaneously helping them and suing them at the same time. It's very confusing.
um, Eric, on the policy front, there's another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is Donald Trump has recently proposed doing away with quarterly reporting requirements for publicly traded companies. And I know that's something that the long term stock exchange has also advocated for, or maybe even proposed it in the first place. I'm not sure. But so I get that. Like it would promote longer term decision making and do away with some of that, toxic short term thinking that we're also familiar with. But it would also reduce transparency for investors. Explain your position a little bit on that and how you think that would play out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I am in the habit of saying we whenever I talk about the long-term stock exchange, but of course I don't run the company anymore, so I've been trying to train myself out of that habit. But yes, this is an LTSE petition, the thing that's been in the news recently, and that the president commented on. And it's been really funny. Before the president weighed in, it was this very arcane, very technical thing that nobody cared about. And then once the president weighed in, it became this hyper polarized partisan food fight, as you can imagine. And what's interesting to me about it is our petition. See, I just did it again. The LTSE petition was not just about getting rid of quarterly reporting, but replacing it with something better. That's really, I think, the crux of the issue is how can we have better, more accurate transparency for investors while reducing reporting frequency? First, let's talk about the motivation why we have to change quarterly reporting. There's really good academic literature on this because there have been several moments in history in various countries where people have switched from semi-annual to quarterly reporting. And it has happened in such a way that we get to have a natural experiment because not everybody switched at the same time. So you can look at the companies that switched versus the companies that didn't switch, what happened. I'll summarize just very, very briefly. Net, companies that switched to quarterly reporting on average exhibit a 5% lower market cap that the semi-annual companies do not. So there's just pretty good evidence that this is costing investors just trillions of dollars, like an unbelievable amount, because it's not so much the cost of preparing the reports that is high, although that is annoying. It's just that because it takes, like a typical public company will spend 1 month of the quarter preparing the quarterly report. It's just too frequent to be able to actually do anything other than run the company for the basis of producing the right report. This is the thing I think most investors do not understand. Today, it is illegal to manipulate the numbers, right? If you cook the books, that's still a crime. It's one of the last things that corporations can still do that is a crime. But what if you run the company in order to massage the numbers to produce the right report? That's considered perfectly legal. And of course, we know that stock buybacks used to be an illegal form of market manipulation. Now they're a completely regular tool. There's so much evidence that the short-term reporting, the short-term compensation structures we're using with managers are causing them to run the company on the basis of those choices. So if you look at the data on average stock holding period, average company longevity, and average executive tenure over the last 50 years, all three have collapsed. We are literally entering an age of temporary organizations being led by temporary managers on behalf of temporary shareholders. And as a result, we're seeing these companies just collapse. They're not being run for the benefit of investors, not even being run for the benefit of anybody. They're just memes. They're just trying to produce a valid report. Now, will getting rid of quarterly reporting by itself solve all these problems? No, obviously not. In order to get rid of quarterly reporting, you need two things that I hope, and the SEC has not acted yet on this petition, so we don't know exactly what their proposal will be. But if they wanted my advice, which for the record they have not asked for, it would be one, to make sure that we have a much more robust event-driven reporting regime. We already have some rules here that says, like, if something material happens, you have to report it. That would be much better to just, when there's actual news, require companies to report it equitably. And then the second thing is when you do report, the way people are reporting GAAP financials now has become like so tortured and convoluted. I think we could do much better to have companies actually report on what their long-term plan is and how they're performing relative. What are the leading indicators of the things that they think will make that future plan work? Unfortunately, today, the regulatory regime is such that you talk to most companies, they've been told by their corporate counsel that giving any kind of insight into what's going to happen in the future, what your actual long-term plans are, will just give you massive extra liability. So that's why they're so parsimonious with their disclosures. So I actually think the quarterly reporting regime, in the name of transparency, has made it much harder for investors to get actual information. And I think the other thing that a lot of investors maybe will be familiar with, in the old days before Reg FD, disclosure was always meant to be a complement to people's actual lived relationship with the company. But with Reg FD, we have literally made it illegal to call the CEO of a company and ask them how it's going to get qualitative knowledge about what's happening. So we've also created this bizarre information asymmetry situation that the only way to communicate to investors is to communicate to everybody at the same time. So the SEC's view is, if there's a rumor going on around you that, the CEO is engaged in some kind of impropriety, which hedge funds love to do this kind of stuff, sort of Yahoo Finance rumor, right? Like, the company is not allowed to say it's not true unless they put out a press release calling attention to the rumor. So they're really stuck being unable to communicate with their long-term investors. So if it was up to me, I would also want to create a mechanism where long-term investors could be given additional information in a way that was safe, obviously, and protected against the possibility of insider trading.
Okay, great. And if you could, and I know you're no longer running it, but can you give us a little update on the long-term stock exchange and the traction you're getting there? I know it's it can be a tough sell.
Oh, sure. No, it's all about compared to what? So have we cracked the duopoly of NYSE Nasdaq? No, obviously not. But there are now 3 companies listed on the long-term stock exchange. That's more than anybody who has ever tried a new listings model since the creation of NASDAQ has ever gotten. And the company makes money from stock trading now. So, it's actually a very strange thing. When I ran the company, we never made any money. I led it through many, many, many years of spending money just to get through the regulatory process, just to get the first companies listed. So, although people always ask me, is it going as well as it should be going, based on some kind of implicit idea that they know how much success it should have had by now, I'm incredibly proud. We've entered into truly uncharted territory, doing something that no one has ever done before.
So the book comes out later this month around Memorial Day. Is there anything more you want to leave our listeners with about the book and sort of your hopes for what you hope will manifest from putting this out there?
Well, I can already tell from the early reviews and early readers that people liked the Lean Startup a lot, and it's obviously sold a lot of copies, but it didn't make anybody cry. And this book it has a very emotional connection with people who've lived this world, not just founders, but people who've been middle managers, board members, leaders, customers who have seen their favorite beloved organizations collapse. Like, I had someone say to me, a civilian, not someone in the business, said to me the other day about a certain beloved brand, man, I hope they're really successful. And they said, well, actually, no, that's not true. I hope they're successful enough to make money, but not so successful that they get bought by private equity. Right? We understand at some level instinctively that in our era, company's success becomes a liability, because the more golden the goose, the more tempting it is to butcher it, the more valuable it becomes as a target. So I would like those of us who care about organizations, to stop being so naive about how to protect them, and to give them the tools they need to resist both the inner temptation to betray and the external pressure to do the same.
Fantastic. Well, Eric, I hope you're right. And thank you for joining us on the podcast today. It's really been a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate the chance to talk about it.
That's going to do it for this Agents of Impact podcast. Big thanks to Eric Ries, to Amy Cortese, to our producer Isaac Silk, to the whole team at Impact Alpha, and to all of you Agents of Impact, with deep gratitude for all that you do.